Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and the book that we've been looking at is Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, a swirl of interlacing argument, ideas and personal reflection of doppelgangers, doubles, duplicates and personal identity, the new landscape of politics and the emerging forces now seeking to shape it. And I'm going to set out its ideas here in two sections, each with three parts. The first section I've named Pandemic as a Portal, with parts called Positioning Kline, Kline's Pandemic Journey, and Political Metamorphasis. And the second section I've named Through the Doppelganger Window, with parts called Culture and Society, Capitalist Shadowlands, and finally Out of the Shadows. So kicking off then with section 1, Pandemic as a Portal, Part 1, Positioning Kline. And I think this is important, as to understand Klein, we need to be clear where she's coming from, not just intellectually, but personally and politically. And that's because this is simultaneously a deeply personal book, but also one written by a public intellectual and a political activist. And this merging of the personal, intellectual and political determines not only the tone of the book, but the overall argument and all the ideas and understandings that make it up. At the personal level, one strand of the book is Klein's own pandemic journey, a journey both painful and redemptive, and told in the reflexive and honest style of a therapeutic encounter of things lost and lessons learnt. At the intellectual level, it's a book of multiple and swirling lines of inquiry, a cornucopia of vignettes and encounters, observations and personal stories, historical survey and political argument, brimming with ideas. It could easily be a book of discrete essays on topics ranging from branding to autism to the Jewish question to the violence underpinning civilization, or the unique post-World War I political experiment that was Red Vienna. Making this for many readers a book constantly engaging, but one whose argument spirals and loops around itself, emerging only quite slowly. At the political level, Klein is a socialist activist in the Marxist mode that sees capitalism as a structure of power, telling us, personally, I think the jury is in on capitalism. It lights up our most uncaring competitive parts and is failing us on every front that matters. And although critical of her own left tribalism and very much looking to cross political divides, on the politics of the pandemic, a theme through which many of her arguments are threaded, she is a supporter of the vaccine programme. And more generally, her political stance is evident across the many themes addressed, from AI to the Israeli state. So it's within these parameters of instinct, political persuasion and intellectual disposition that Klein weaves her many-stranded arguments into a tapestry of self-reflection and post-pandemic politics. And it's to the first of these, self-reflection, that brings us to part 2, Klein's pandemic journey. And I've called this Klein's pandemic journey, but more accurately it should be called Klein and Wolf's pandemic journey, both because this is a book about the shared fate of doubles and doppelgangers, and because both Klein and Wolf travelled through and were transformed by the pandemic, but crucially in opposite directions. Klein from a high point of collective power and hope, only to become diminished and isolated. Wolf from a low point of a career-ending humiliation, who would be restored to her former glory. And I've called the first section of this discussion The Pandemic as a Portal, following Klein's reference to Arundhati Roy's essay The Pandemic is a Portal, posted in the early days of COVID as a shared expression of hope that the pandemic might lead not just to something different, but to something better. But as we all know, all that accumulated hope would be broken by a different reality, by a pandemic that was indeed a portal, but for Klein, not to a fairer, more democratic and more purposeful world, but to personal isolation, social anger and political unravelling. And it's in this setting that we find the beginning of Klein's doppelganger trouble and what she describes as a descent into something resembling a crisis, which might be understood as a double crisis of the personal and of the political, where at the personal level Naomi Wolf would eclipse Naomi Klein, and at the political level where what she would later call diagonalist politics would eclipse the progressive left, and which will be the theme of the next part of this presentation. But in this part of the story, Wolf emerges as the first of many of Klein's doppelgangers, a conceptual framing that she uses again and again to illuminate all manner of repressions and projections in ourselves and in our world. But in this first instance, the doppelganger she calls Other Naomi becomes her double, shadow, anti-self and evil twin, which, like the unscrupulous and flamboyant double in Dostoevsky's book of the same name, threatens, through sheer tenacious energy, to replace her and steal her life. And Other Naomi is the perfect template for this first incarnation of the doppelganger, a Jewish writer of big idea books, whose own remarkable trajectory over the pandemic reads as the inverted double negative of Klein's. And for her part in this dance of opposites, Wolf travels a long way, firstly in her own roller coaster of fortune and its wild oscillations between failure and success, and secondly across and perhaps beyond the political spectrum. She first emerges in the 90s as a feminist icon, then follows Blair and Clinton to the political centre, all the while in the ascendancy and towards success and influence. In the words of Klein, she followed meritocracy's rules and rode its elevator floor by floor to the top. High school, debate club, Yale, then Oxford, liberal media darling and advisor to some of the most powerful men in the world. But then came a moment that would upend her life and change it forever, when, live on the BBC, she was informed that the entire premise of her latest book, Outrages about the persecution of gay love, was built on a research error and subsequent misunderstanding so great as to render it useless. As Klein puts it, rarely does a reputation collapse so publicly and so decisively. She was dropped by her US publisher, the book was pulped, The Guardian stopped publishing her articles, and university courses started using excerpts from the book as a cautionary tale of how not to do research. And in Klein's account, this was probably the moment, after being shamed, mocked and pulped, that Wolf began to blaze an entirely new trail into what Klein calls the mirror world, a place of conspiracy, alternative facts and strange bedfellows. And so began Wolf's embrace of conspiracy, which before COVID Klein describes as a kind of hobby. Ebola, Snowden, 5G, ISIS, all were given conspiracy twists, but she never stayed on one subject for very long. But with the pandemic, experienced not only through bodies but also through social media, this now became her sole focus, its origins, shutdowns, tests and mandates. And honing her message to an audience now in a state of generalised fear, and becoming a skilled player in the attention economy, she began both to rebuild her profile and to seriously ramp up the conspiracy, telling her new and growing band of followers, amongst other things, that under the guise of the medical emergency, a transnational group of bad actors, from the CCP to Anthony Fauci, were variously plotting to strip our rights, grab our DNA, sterilise us, kill our babies, track our every move, overthrow the Constitution, crush humanity, and erode the power of the West, all of which was articulated through the imagery and the language of the Nazis, and perhaps the spirit of which is best captured by the title of her hugely successful YouTube post, Slavery Forever, And with this message, Wolf found a new cause, a new home, and a new voice. But while Wolf was reclaiming her voice, Klein was losing hers. Unlike Wolf, she had entered the pandemic portal with energised optimism, as the campaign to make Bernie Sanders the Democratic presidential nominee created for her such collective power and possibility that, like Arundhati Roy, she dared to dream. But the dream was turned to a nightmare after COVID took her from the movement and the community that had given her meaning, and now in pandemic isolation, obsessively and helplessly tracked the rise of her doppelganger, and how she, Naomi Klein, was fast becoming at first confused with Naomi Wolf, then conflated with her altogether, so that as Wolf moved from writing about women's bodies to denouncing corporate exploitation, Klein tells us she began to sound just like me, only with conspiracy twists. And with the pandemic raising the stakes politically and personally, Klein describes having to watch as Wolf appeared to gradually take her name, her profile, her brand, and most crucially, her politics, feeding them through what she calls the bonkers blender to produce a thought puree, both dangerous and, for Klein, a humiliation. Speaking about that time, she says, "After COVID cancelled so many of the things who told me who I was in the world, my public self shrank to that of a thumbnail-sized photograph. Wolf kept on talking and typing for the both of us in a daily shower of conspiracy theory, of vaccine shredding, plots against America and fascist coups, becoming for Klein, as Philip Roth would put it, too ridiculous to take seriously, but too serious to be ridiculous, such that Klein ended up down, speechless, and increasingly obsessed with Wolf, following her down a warren of rabbit holes, the most consequential of which led both Naomis to Steve Bannon, another pivotal character in Klein's story, and whose embrace of Wolf would complete her restoration to relevance, as well as complete her political conversion to become a very different political animal for a very different kind of politics, so that 22 years after writing The Beauty Myth, Wolf was proudly posting pictures of her newly acquired firearm. And this story of the pandemic, and of Klein and Wolf's serial transformations through it, is also part of a larger story of change across the societies and the politics of the West, where, in a larger echo of Klein's fall and Wolf's rise, the retreat of the progressive left has been matched by the birth of a new and potent configuration of what socialists like Klein still recognise as the right, which brings us to part 3, political metamorphasis. And in this part of the story, Bannon is central, as by supercharging Wolf's personal story, by placing it at the centre of this new emerging politics, he bridges from the personal to the political and sets the scene for Klein's inquiry into the formation of a new political force that has been called populism and intuitively many might label as Trumpism, but which she terms what scholars of European politics are calling Diagnalism. But before explaining what this is, some context is necessary. Again, the pandemic, as the accelerator of change and transformation, is the start point, where for Klein, what she first hoped would be a portal to a better world became a threat multiplier, layered on top of many other repressed emergencies and political betrayals, many in number and long eroding people's faith in politics and the state. The forced sterilisation of US black and indigenous communities in the 1930s, the financial crisis of 2008, bailing out the bankers, abandoning homeowners, discarding the working class, falling real wages, exploding inequality, and an all-pervasive uncertainty where the possibility of owning a home or scraping enough money to pay soaring rents or holding on to a job are all, in the words of Klein, tilting and rolling, which is to say that in a world of staggering wealth, more and more people are struggling to live. And if all this turmoil should be the natural terrain of the left, its political failure to capitalise on this accumulated distress and anger is an even more pertinent context for the rise of diagonalism, especially for Klein, who tells us the left's fighting and fracturing was the greatest cause of her mounting despair, where it often behaved in ways neither inclusive or caring, often stuck in identity essentialism, speaking an incomprehensible jargon, and spending too much time policing borders and turning on people who saw themselves on our side, instead of creating a credible alternative and building new coalitions of support. It has alienated its natural working class constituency and begun devouring itself from the inside, as Klein puts it. When entire categories of people are reduced to their race and gender and labelled privileged, there is little room to confront the myriad ways that working class white men and women are abused under our predatory capitalist order. And Bannon, whom Klein acknowledges to be a highly skilled strategist, is watching all of this closely. The issues we are abandoning and ignoring, the people we are insulting and discarding, the debates we aren't having, studying all our hypocrisies and inconsistencies, and from these is weaving together a political strategy that may serve as an exemplar of diagonalism. And it's a bold strategy built on a deep understanding of power and how it can be accumulated, and it has at least 4 elements. Firstly, it's a strategy for enlarging power by harnessing and mobilising all the anger and despair of the very many people who feel discarded, abandoned and robbed of their dreams, which is then directed not only against their rivals, but against the whole liberal order. Secondly, and to guarantee the anger hits the spot, it's a strategy crafted around the betrayals of his rivals, who, in Bannon's case, he frames as the highly educated, snobbish and sectarian liberal elites, dissing the working class, and who are responsible for all the trade deals that put so many people out of good jobs. Thirdly, it's a strategy of building a diverse and continually expanding coalition, identifying issues and people that really should belong to their opponents, but which have been abandoned by them. And stepping into the empty space, Bannon and his people speak directly to this growing band of the disaffected, to their concerns, their fears, and especially their anger. And Bannon takes every opportunity to fulsomely welcome every conceivable recruit to the cause, always looking for new opportunities to forge unexpected coalitions of support. No better illustrated than the coalition between the Jewish feminist Wolf and the Catholic hard-right strategist Bannon, or between evangelical Christians, white wealthy wellness entrepreneurs and gym rats, in this instance bonded by a shared belief in their own purity, of faith or of their bodies, or between growing numbers of black and Latino men, all united by a rich ecosystem of conspiracy, and for some, the opportunity to make money. And fourthly, and most strikingly, it's designed to remake reality itself by appropriating language, especially the language used to describe politics, flipping it, trivialising it, debasing it, draining it of meaning, and rendering it absurd, confidently declaring the old left-right distinctions as null and void, and creating distorted doppelganger versions of established political discourse, such as the deep state, once used to describe the particularities of the Turkish state, or fake news, previously called propaganda, both routinely used and correspondingly drained of all meaning. And in what Klein describes as the mass unravelling of meaning, this all works to rob the progressive left of meaningful language, both to describe what is happening and build opposition to it. Klein calls this Pippicism, after the character Moshe Pippic from Philip Roth's Doppelganger novel Operation Shylock, where both the fictional character of the book and the very real new players in the new politics like Trump and Vance, inconsequentialise, farcialise and trivialise language and ideas. Slavery forever, vaccine genocide, the Green New Deal, now coined the Great Reset. Once an idea has been pippicked, it can never be serious again, making rigorous discussion impossible and farcialising not only what diagonalists say, but also what their opponents are able to say in response. This, then, is Bannon's strategy, which also serves as a definition of diagonalism, from the German Querdenken, meaning diagonal or outside-the-box thinking, and which is now consciously seeking to create an entirely new political landscape of dissidents, blended convictions, and novel constellations of people and groups, energised by anger and united by conspiracy, and who have been finding each other, Klein tells us, with the force of a magnetic pull, and self-assembling into what one commentator calls a kind of conspiracy singularity. And if Naomi Wolf emerges as the first of many of Klein's doppelgangers, here is the second, not a personal doppelganger, but a political one, which Klein calls the mirror world, which is of course the world of the diagonalists, mimicking the beliefs and concerns that feed off progressive failures and silences, and which is now generating a counter-mirroring, or a mirroring on both sides, a kind of political doubling, with society split, and each side defining itself against the other. Progressives believing that millions have given themselves over to fantasy, and the diagonalists countering it is they, the sheeple, who are stuck in the matrix of group thinking and collective hysteria. As Klein puts it, it's as if when something becomes an issue in the mirror world, it automatically ceases to matter everywhere else. I sometimes feel as if we are tethered to each other as reverse marionettes. Their arm goes up, ours goes down, we kick, they hug. This, then, is the personal and the political story that Klein tells as the spine of her book, and it's a story given shape and definition by her doppelganger framing. And to better understand this, and to see how Klein uses it to extend her argument into many, many more features of our society, we now turn to section 2, Through the Doppelganger Window, part 1, Culture and Society. And doppelganger, of course, is a cultural concept, which long before it was named was a kind of psychological intuition seen in ancient mythology, and later systemized by Freud and Jung as manifestations of how the human psyche represses, partitions off, and projects onto others what it cannot bear and does not want to see, the rejected, depraved, and evil parts of ourselves, all of which reside in our hidden shadow self, which is to say, in our doppelganger. And in the hands of Dostoevsky, Hans Christian Andersen, Edgar Allan Poe, Ursula Le Guin, Philip Roth, and many others, this human duality between self and doppelganger shadow self has been extensively mined in literature and film, invariably as a Jekyll and Hyde-like and deeply disturbing encounter with our hidden self, a self that is a distillation of our deepest fears and most violent desires, but also one that emerges as a warning of the threat it poses not only to our ordinary and ordered sense of self, but even to our very existence, producing a fiction with many memorable and varied doppelgangers, from the picture of Dorian Gray to Philip Roth's ridiculously serious Moshi Pippic. And just as the figure of the doppelganger occurs across culture and in many different forms, so Klein also brings to this gallery of long-established doppelgangers all manner of additional doubles, with her own imaginative cast of doppelganger characters and types, digital doppelgangers with their own personas, brands and avatars, social doppelgangers with their polarised and partitioned communities. But of all the various doppelgangers that she explores, the one that concerns her most is the hidden tyrant, or as she puts it, the the Nazi in the mirror. Though, she says, the doppelganger archetype has appeared across time to explore issues of life and death, the body versus the soul, the ego versus the id, the real child versus the false, this is something else that the figure of the double or the evil twin has long been used to warn us about, the shadow tyrant who lives in us all and lies in wait in every nation. And given her Jewishness and political persuasion, it's perhaps no surprise that she chooses Isreal to most fully illustrate this, telling us, I find myself drawn to this place that for so much of my life has been my own shadowland, a place I've struggled with in public and in private. And here in this book, she devotes a great deal of attention to the Jewish question, anti-Semitism and the state of Israel, and especially it's the Israeli state which for her is the most striking example of the tyrant within. And it's also where she offers some of her most imaginative doppelganger framings, especially as the creation of Israel changed so much about being Jewish. And of course, anti-Semitism has produced one of history's enduring doppelgangers, of the Jew as the rootless money-hoarding killer of Christ, an eternal Shylock used by European Christians to legitimate centuries of pogroms and the killing of Jews. But for Klein, the history of victimhood this has produced has been complicated by the creation of Israel as a colonial project displacing an existing people, all of which has made Israel a complex psychological space where victims also become perpetrators and where everything is now in double, a place of doppelganger politics producing new doppelganger types. And perhaps this begins with the framing of the Palestinians as their own anti-self, just as the European Christians projected all evil onto the satanic Jew. Now Israel and its logic of occupation needs its own anti-self to legitimate what it's doing. Where once Jews were on the receiving end, now the Palestinian has become what they once were, the eternal threat, inside, outside, everywhere. And it's a surprise to no one that Klein is fiercely critical of the Israeli state, and from that critical place she offers other examples of doppelganger politics, where Israel might be seen as doppelganger to the chauvinistic European nationalism, as she puts it, a state to mimic and twin the same militant nationalism that oppressed them for centuries, or, in a similar way of thinking, as doppelganger to the settler colonial project, using the same slogans, terra nullius, manifest destiny, land without a people for a people without land, and with the same genocidal intent. And because Klein argues it is psychologically intolerable to participate in the same violent othering as was done to you, many, perhaps most Israelis, choose not to see what is too much to bear, and instead project their darkness and demons onto the Palestinian other. And it's in this spirit of not seeing that we move to the next section, part 2, Capitalist Shadowlands. And despite all that I've said about all her interesting topics, Doppelganger, like all her books, is, above all else, a book about capitalism, whose imperitives, she argues, explain a lot about the kinds of doubling discussed so far, and which has produced its own hidden shadow that Klein calls the Shadowlands. But before touching on these, it's worth observing that, as with the discussion of the Jewish question, Klein is both expansive and clear on capitalism, sharing with fellow intellectual activist Yanis Varoufakis a sophisticated and strongly held materialist conviction that the imperitives and logic of capitalism are convulsing our world and destroying all of life. And of course, this all builds on the original Marxist insight that made it one of history's great conspiracy theories. Only for Klein, this particular conspiracy happens to be real, or more precisely true. After all, its anti-human imperatives can be seen everywhere. But just as important, it's also a framework for understanding, substantiated by serious scholarship, and empirically demonstrated by a rich history of proven conspiracies, from the overthrow of elected governments through to the programming of cars to cover up their diesel emissions. And for Klein, it's all a question of how best to make sense of all this, or put differently, what's the most convincing way to understand power. Arguing that liberalism thinks of power as residing in individuals rather than structures, substituting individual motivations for the imperitives and structural logic of capitalism, and this tends to explanations based on the perceived qualities of individual personalities, which in the hands of conspiracy theorists produces a worldview populated by cartoon heroes and villains, and all manner of highly imaginative but intellectually empty projections, so that for the most part, conspiracy theories, despite the routine references to scientists and thousands of pages of scientific documents, is a case of conspiracy without the theory. Whereas for Klein, a structural account of power is far more convincing, coherent and powerful. As Klein puts it, I have always believed that one of the core reasons for the left to exist is to provide a structural analysis of wealth and power that brings order and rigour to the prevailing and correct sense that society is rigged against the majority and that important truths are being hidden. And this sense of a deeper, much more ordinary reality beneath the sensational and lurid stories of secret cabals and child-eating paedophiles is crucial because, again quoting Klein, conspiracy theories get the facts wrong, but often they get the feelings right. The feeling of living in a world with shadowlands, that every human misery is someone else's profit, of being exhausted by predation and extraction. The word for the system driving those feelings starts with C, but if no one ever taught you how capitalism works, then it's easy to see how you might confuse it with another C word, conspiracy. And again, it's these hidden truths beneath the feelings that so many of us choose not to see, where partitioning ourselves and projecting onto others are steps that make up the dance of avoidance, especially for those, like Klein, who live in settler societies that she argues have never truly reckoned with the fact that these nations exist only because of stolen land, stolen people, slavery and genocide. Again, all part of the matrix and unfolding logic of capitalist power. And in all of this, in our very troubled times, when every day brings us closer to climate breakdown, Klein offers up a chilling metaphor, whereby the ghosts of the past, the present and the future are all racing towards us all at once, and they're all coming from the Shadowlands, the hidden subterranean world of suffering, violence and zones of hyper-exploitation that lie beneath and unseen the brightly lit, gleaming, sleek storefront of capitalism. Industrial farms, factories and slaughterhouses, mountains of waste and poisoned waterways, immigration detention facilities and holding zones, boats that won't make it through a mild storm, or tent cities that grow in our gleaming cities. All are the hidden and dense understory of our supposedly frictionless economy. Frictionless is the great promise of our age, she says, but friction doesn't disappear just because we don't see it. It is simply displaced onto the lives of pure friction in the Shadowlands. And it would not be surprising if Klein's journey into these Shadowlands, indeed into her own shadows of personal disorientation and political defeat, if she might have surrendered to pessimism, but she ends the book grounded and in many ways restored, telling us that what began as self-defence to reassert myself as the owner of my ideas, identity and name gradually became a form of self-release, which brings us to a very brief part 4, Out of the Shadows. And it's worth saying here that the substance and value of this book lies perhaps more in its diagnosis than its suggestions for cure, and perhaps its greatest value is to decipher the chaos of doppelganger culture, and in so doing adding new texture to our understanding of the crises currently engulfing us. And out of this, two particular insights might be emphasised. Firstly, our crisis is in many ways a crisis of unseeing, not seeing ourselves, not seeing one another, not seeing the world, and not seeing the connections between all of us. And secondly, it's a crisis of what she calls the overinflated self, arguing that, yes, there is a technical way to understand our crisis of capitalism and climate change, but it can also be understood as a surplus of the self, and all the energy it takes to service those selves fortunate enough to live outside the Shadowlands, where 50 years of neoliberal self-worship has blinded us to reality itself, and to the degree that she offers solutions beyond those already known from her earlier work. It's in response to these insights where she offers added and perhaps novel emphasis, arguing that just as her own journey became a form of self-release, so a wider social journey to unselfing may well hold the key to our collective survival. And in the first instance, this is a political unselfing. And in this spirit, and inspired by Bannon's welcome-based coalition building, Klein advocates loosening the grip of selfhood, melting some of the hard, icy edges of identity, and moving towards anyone who shares a desire to confront the forces of annihilation and extermination. Change requires collaboration and coalition. We must again become alive to the possibility of collective power, and there are connections, solidarities, and kinships available to all, should we choose. In many ways, what she's arguing for is a coalition for life against the forces of fragmentation and death. And again, like Bannon, it must always look to action, beyond our victimisation and based on the recognition of shared interests, the pleasures of camaraderie, and occasionally the thrill of victory. Hard on structures but soft on people, and attempting with great urgency to imagine a world that does not require Shadowlands and is not predicated on sacrificial people, sacrificial ecologies and sacrificial continents, and then beginning at once to build it. This then completes Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, a book of deep reflection, multiple lines of argument, profound insight, and a much needed guide for the chaos of our times.